For those who don't know EPAM, we are 20,000 software engineers and product developers based globally. We do an awful lot of work in the travel and hospitality industry. My own background is actually in the financial services sector. I come from a strategic consulting background and specifically looking at the role of payments and how payments affect customer journeys, how they affect product development, how they are evolving, and helping companies to understand what their strategic response to the changes in the payments market should be. Normally when I go to industry events, it's full of bankers complaining about Brexit, so this has been a great fresh breath of air for me. I've got quite an ambitious amount of stuff to go through. I am going to go quite fast, and the reason I will be zipping through quite quickly is because actually today we've published a white paper on this subject, and it's on our website, and we'll be sending out a link later. So if I go too quickly over any aspects, you can read it in more detail in due course. But broadly speaking, what I'll be talking about today is the rise of alternative payments, what the drivers are behind those, so why they're becoming more and more significant, and what the challenges and opportunities are around that, specifically in the hospitality industry, where there are more challenges than in many other industries around that, and how you can approach those challenges. I don't expect you to be able to read this. Alternative payments, everyone is familiar with new payment types which involve paying with a mobile phone, Apple Pay, Alipay, even whatever they might be. And that is immediately the focus of what the drivers are around alternative payments. It's that technological driver of the mobile phone. And that's very significant. Whenever a new technical feature is added to a mobile phone, it's invariably then co-opted into the payments process. So you get proximity payments when you're using your mobile phone at a point of sale in a shop, which are enabled by things like NFC, Bluetooth, the camera reading QR codes, and so on. There are also developments around security. So obviously there's biometric authentication, which helps to secure a transaction. There's the thing called tokenization of card details and other payment details, which means there's an extra layer of encryption added to each payment. And this is very significant because security is a key enabler that differentiates alternative payments from other payment types, such as credit cards. In fact, just the existence of a mobile phone, a lump of hardware that's standing in your pocket or in your hand when you're making the payment, is itself an authentication factor, which makes that payment more secure. By far the most important driver, technically, is the existence of the App Store. So for the first time, if you want to roll out a new payment scheme, all you have to do is write an app and invite people to download it. And suddenly, all those barriers to entry that payments providers have had in the past are blown away. You can have 100,000 people using your payment overnight. The technological drivers are the most visible, but underpinning them are the regulatory drivers. And this is a global phenomenon amongst regulators who are moving away from wanting to clamp down and add security around payments and financial transactions and into a space where they want to encourage competition and to encourage innovation. And this is going to make this change we're currently seeing in payments a very permanent feature because they are enabling these firms to have access to payment schemes, to have access to bank accounts, and encouraging the take-up of a whole range of new payment products. And all of this leads to consumers getting raised expectations around how payments will work in their pocket. There's a wide range of things called alternative payments. The actual definition is a bit vague, but for our purposes, an alternative payment is anything that is not a credit card payment. So the rise of alternative payments means the decline of credit cards. There's lots of different categories here. Not all of them are mobile enabled. Some of them, for example, will be around domestic card schemes. Some of them will be vouchers which are paid for in advance or after the fact once a transaction's been made online. But the majority are enabled by mobile phones. including through a range of apps to initiate direct credit transfers in your bank account and so on. A key feature of alternative payments is that they are localized. There are an awful lot of different types of alternative payment, and you probably wouldn't recognize the ones that aren't available where you live. But that doesn't mean they're not huge in other parts of the world. The reason they're localized is this barrier to entry thing. You need to have a critical mass of people wanting to use that payment type before it becomes cost effective. You also need a critical mass of people wanting to accept that payment. You might need to convince the local regulators, acquirers, processors, even handset manufacturers, whatever it might be. So there is an incentive to focus on one geographic area rather than doing it more widespread. Having said that, there are certain ones that are now beginning to grow, which you will recognize. Alipay, for example, huge in China, but beginning to spread around the world as well. There is no one type of alternative payment that is coming out tops. The key feature when we look at the change in alternative payments, and this data from WorldPay indicating what they see as the rise in payment types between 2015 and 2020, the key factor is, if I can get this right, that credit cards are declining. So in that 5-year period, credit cards going down by approximately 20%, which is a huge shift. There is no particular type of alternative payment that's winning because there's huge variation globally and different brands come and go. But the main drift is around credit cards declining. What's causing this? Now, this is where we start to enter into the world of buzzwords. Generation Z. I can't bring myself to say Generation Z. I know I get a clap, but Z is going to have to work. Generation Z in the USA and other developed countries who are used to having credit cards, this new generation of millennials don't necessarily have the same addiction to them. They don't like the big brand names of established banks. They don't want to pay for things on credit. And they're addicted to their mobile phones. But there are much bigger shifts, and this is the second buzzword, China. Thank you, yes. So 2 graphs here. The graph on the left is World Bank figures around numbers of international travellers and where they depart from. And you can see that in the last 15 years, there's a steady growth. The big light blue area, that's all Europe, and this dark blue area is Asia and the Pacific. So that's the impact of China growing, and it's roughly 2.5 times growth. The chart on the right is projected future growth over the next 15 years. And this is information from the Brookings Institution, and it's about the spending power of the middle classes globally in trillions of dollars. Because it's the middle classes who, let's face it, are going to be the travellers of the future. They've got the money that you'll be targeting. And again, very clearly you can see that it's this bottom line here, which is Asia, that is growing roughly 3-fold in the next 15 years. So in 15 years' time, the demographic of target customers is going to look very different from what it does today, and it's going to be Asia-centric. Why is this relevant? Because in China, only about 10% of e-commerce transactions are paid for using MasterCard and Visa. You look at Alipay, you look at WeChat Pay, you look at domestic card schemes, they are much larger. We conducted a little bit of research looking at how the hospitality industry is responding to this change in alternative payments. Some of these findings won't be very surprising. Credit cards rule, that's a pretty obvious one. So MasterCard and Visa were the only 2 payment types which were absolutely regularly accepted by all hotel chains. The next point is worth exploring a little bit, because this comes down to the merchant of record question, which many of you will have heard of. Of the top 15 chains we looked at, almost all of them ran a check digit analysis on the card number when it was entered. We know this because we entered a range of different types of card numbers, some valid, some not, to see what happened. The check digit is a free check you can do. You just need to look at the numbers on the credit card and see whether it's a valid format, essentially. So you'd expect them all to get that right. If you then want to go to the next level and check whether the credit card is itself valid, you need to run a transaction against it. It can just be for $1, but you run that to see whether the card is declined or not. We did that as well. And there, the number drops off very rapidly. Less than a third actually run a transaction to check whether the card is valid. This is significant because what that's saying is that those chains accepting credit cards at the point of booking probably are not merchant of record because they're not actually checking that card. And there's a cost to not checking the card. There's a cost in terms of credit risk. There's a cost in terms of fraud. The reason they're not merchant of record is because they delegate the processing of that payment to the hotel itself. And the hotel is acting as merchant of record. This means that the next point comes in. Payment options are property-centric. So each hotel will give you its own range of payment options when you actually go there. And that can be at the regional level as well. And the reason for that is because the relationship between the hotel and the payment provider is direct, and it is not mediated by the hotel chain. So you get this variation in types of payments that are accepted globally, even within the same hotel chain. OTAs, on the other hand, are gradually moving towards what's called a guest-centric approach. That means that instead of asking where you're staying and then offering you payment types based on that, they ask you where you come from. So if you're a Chinese guest and you're staying in Denmark, they will offer you the option to pay with Alipay. Not all of them, but they're beginning to get there. Now, again, I apologize, I'm new to the travel industry, so what I'm displaying on the board here is a very generic guest journey, and any hotel chain will immediately point out that that's not the way that they do it, but actually there are similarities, and we'll all be able to spot where those are. There is a very strong symbiotic relationship at the moment between credit cards and hospitality industry. Credit cards have been around for 30 years or so, and this sort of standard journey has basically grown up around them because credit cards enable this merchant of record situation where when you take the booking, you don't have to process the payment. And they enable it through various things. Firstly, credit cards are ubiquitous, so you can pretty much guarantee, or you have been able to pretty much guarantee, that the sort of people who are international travelers will have a credit card, and therefore it's pretty safe that you can get away with just asking for Visa and MasterCard. Secondly, they enable deferred processing. So if you ask for those credit card details at point of booking, you don't need to process the payment at that point. You can pass those details on to the hotel, or whatever it is down the line, to enable that payment to be taken later. So you can get away with this merchant of record thing. And thirdly, they are credit products. In order to get a credit card, someone somewhere has got to have done a background check on you. They've got to make sure that you are credit worthy. And so just by accepting a credit card, you are essentially giving yourself some guarantee that the person who's coming to stay is kosher and isn't going to run away without paying. This has enabled what is actually a very comfortable customer journey. And for 30 years, it's been pretty good. You hand in your credit card details, then you go and check in. You would then generally have to give your details again a second time. That again's a bit more painful. The reason you have to do that is because you can accept more information from the credit card when it's there in person, and it becomes more secure, and therefore the risk of chargebacks is lower, and so on. You then might have to hand it in again for incidentals during the stay. In some circumstances, you might then need to present the credit card again at checkout. So it becomes rather bumpy, a jarring journey. And that's just one of the pain points. So the pain points to look at from the credit card journey are around lack of choice, inconsistent approach with different hotels, even within the same chain, offering slightly different processes, repetitive, that you have to keep giving those details back in again, and impersonal. Everybody goes through the same process. Let's explore that a bit. Now, this is a payments journey of the future, or a guest journey of the future. There's nothing very innovative or new here. I'm sure that every speaker, when they're talking about a mobile-enabled future guest journey, is going to come up with something pretty similar to this. And the mobile is very, very important here, because the mobile enables you to choose your payment type. And a lot of alternative payments, as we've seen, are based around the mobile. The key changes here, okay, obviously there's choice. So when you're booking, if you're allowing for alternative payments to be taken, then you can pay immediately using your phone. The one-click thing. The best payment experience is one that you don't notice. Nobody likes paying, and it's important not to focus too much on trying to make the payment experience great, because it never will be. Nobody likes it. The companies that do payments really well are the companies that completely take payments out of the equation. Uber, you never need to pay, because it's all done in the background. Airbnb, similarly, you don't hand over your credit card each time you book a room. The important one is probably Amazon. They've enabled one click. You see something, you click on it, it's yours. You don't have to worry about the whole payment process. And that is a goal that's worth aiming for. So in the guest journey of the future, you're enabling that one-click experience. And you've got to do that at this stage by having something within the app or the interface that the customer is using which stores the payment details and enables them to just quickly move straight into it. This also means that then, at the future points where you might need to have further payment interactions, it's a straightforward process. It's one click. You get out your phone, you put your thumb on the key or whatever you might do, and the payment goes. It's instant. There might still be those payment processes there, but it becomes normal and part of the experience. Personalised. Key point to remember about alternative payments is that alternative payments are instant payments. If you want to pay with a direct credit transaction or with an e-wallet or with Apple Pay or whatever it is, when you pay, you pay. There is no deferral. And that's not what people who use alternative payments expect. So if you're booking and paying with an alternative payment type, that is when you pay. You say, I want to pay with SoFort. Authorize the payment, the money goes from your account immediately. Very different from the old journey where that money might not leave your account at all before you even arrive in the hotel. Because of that, it throws up some challenges. Firstly, do guests necessarily want to pay for their hotel stay up front if they've been used not to doing so? I would argue probably that's fine. They know that they're paying with a form that takes the payment immediately, and that's what they're used to doing in every other industry. But that might not be the case. And the personalization aspect comes in where you need to decide how much money you want up front, because you don't have that guarantee. It's a soft guarantee, but it's a guarantee of the credit card details. So you need to decide, do you want a deposit to be taken? Do you want the full amount of money to be taken? And in order to make that decision, you need some intelligent risk scoring. And that risk scoring means that you need to know the customer, you need to know how they normally interact with you, you need to know whether they've always paid in the past. You need to know how long they're planning to stay for on this occasion, where they're planning on staying, how busy that hotel is, all sorts of other information to enable you to decide whether you want that payment to be taken in full upfront before the guest arrives but at a future date, or just a deposit. That then leads into a personalised approach. And personalisation here is more than just remembering what their preferences are or remembering their credit card details. It's about actually changing the journey for that guest based on the fact that you know them really well. We've heard an awful lot about the user experience being at the centre of everything that we must do, and yet secretly everyone knows that actually money is pretty important too. Yes, you can create a fantastic user experience by enabling alternative payments through a mobile device and completely changing the way you do things, but it's important also to keep an eye on the bottom line. And the good news is that actually there are an awful lot of financial benefits involved in embracing this new payment approach. Just starting at the top, looking at lower fees. So at the moment, if you've got a Dutch visitor staying here in the Mandalay Bay and he's bringing along his MasterCard with him, I don't know the details of exactly what's going to be charged, but I would imagine you're looking at 4 to 5% transaction fee because it's a card issued in Holland, there are cross-border charges, and so on. It would be cheaper if it was a USA-issued card, but it's not. That same guest, if he was paying for something online in Holland, would almost definitely not be using a credit card at all. He'd probably be using Ideal, which is a direct credit transfer product, which means the money leaves his bank account immediately and goes to the merchant's account, and which accounts for 72% of all e-commerce transactions in Holland. That's his preferred payment type. The transaction fees attached to that are measured in cents. I think it's 20 cents. It probably varies a little bit. But effectively, it's nothing compared to a 4% on the cost of a hotel stay. So if you can take an Ideal payment, not only is he happy, because he's paying as he wants to, but you've immediately made 4% profit on that stay. There are other aspects of lower fees as well. At the moment, if a guest from China wants to come and stay, they're used to paying for it with Alipay, so they probably will try to do that at point of booking and then be told that they can't. So their next stop is to go to an OTA, which does accept Alipay. They'll book the same room, roughly the same price, and they'll use their preferred payment type. And the hotel will have to pay higher commissions to the OTA. If you can get rid of that loss of customers and start encouraging people to use direct channels, again, you start making a greater percentage on each booking. There are other areas as well. Looking at efficiencies, we heard earlier today about the painful processes involved in dealing with credit cards, especially when things don't go right, all the chargebacks and the disputes. You can get rid of all of those, pretty much, if you're accepting alternative payment types, because the payment is immediate, you don't get that credit risk, you don't get the fraud risk, it comes straight into your account, and there's less room for dispute around it all. There are additional revenue possibilities as well. Alternative payments are instant payments. If someone's booked a month in advance, you've got that cash sitting in your account, and you're benefiting from that. Also, if they paid a month ago and then they're arriving at the hotel, suddenly that room upgrade doesn't look nearly as expensive as it did when they first made the booking, because it's only a small incremental amount of money. So there are benefits. But let's be realistic about some of the drawbacks as well. Becoming a merchant of record is expensive. There are an awful lot of new operational constraints and things that have to happen in order for that to work. There are new process flows, there are new payment flows. Suddenly the money is coming to the central organisation and then being dispersed outwards to the hotels. All of this needs to be planned for, operations need to change around that and cope with it. There are various other changes. I won't step through all of these because it depends exactly what model you go for as to what the changes are likely to be. And there is no one-size-fits-all solution here. Broadly speaking, learning lessons from other industries, there are two potential approaches and probably lots of shades of grey in between. On the one hand, you can become an agent, and that means you take the money and then you take a commission on that booking and you pay the rest to the hotel once the guest leaves. Very similar to the OTA model. Challenges there are around liability. It can be managed, but if you are taking the payment instead of the hotel taking the payment, you need to be very careful as to who exactly owns the liability for when things go wrong with that booking. The alternative approach is what's called the marketplace model, and this would be something like an eBay approach, where you're effectively operating as a marketplace provider, connecting the guest to the hotel they want to stay in. You're processing the payment, but you're doing it on behalf of the hotel and acting as a payment service provider for them. So you're taking the money and passing it straight to them, or possibly holding it safely in an escrow account so it can't be touched and it can't earn interest, ready for when it's the right time to pass that on to the hotel. You probably dodge some of the liability issues there, but suddenly you become a payment service provider, and that means you need to be regulated as a payment service provider, which again is a massive sideways step, an operational challenge. These are two extreme options. There are probably grey areas in between. Certainly, every hotel chain will have a different benefits that they need to consider when looking at all of these, and probably you'll be looking at different models for every country you operate in, because there's a different weight of regulation and legal onus that you need to take into consideration. So depending on what kind of approach you want to adopt, there are a variety of operational challenges you need to look at. The good news is you don't have to do them all yourself. There are plenty of payment service providers out there who will help you. In fact, one of them is WorldPay, that's talking next door at the moment. It's an option. As far as I'm aware, there are no products in the marketplace that are designed for the hospitality industry at the moment. So when you're choosing a provider, you need to think of it as engaging in the beginning of a dialogue, because you need to work out what of these operational aspects you want to cover and what you want to outsource to them. They should be very good, for example, at negotiating banking relationships globally so that you can process transactions regionally. But again, that might be something that you think you can do better and cheaper. And that's why precisely how that's going to work will be up to each individual hotel chain to work out. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. How are we doing on time? We're okay. The next thing to think around is how you roll this out. Doing this is a huge change operationally, and it's something that's best thought about as a strategic project that's going to take many years to deliver. The operational changes that you need to think about, the relationships you need to form with people who can help you globally, manage different payment types around the world, and then managing the relationship with your hotels and franchisees so that terms and conditions are gradually updated and that they are bought into the idea of now taking payment services from you as part of the franchise package. So there's a range of stakeholders that need to be engaged. In order to make it work, you need to set a vision for what it's going to look like ultimately, and then design implementation steps incrementally so that all stakeholders benefit at each stage and each step looks like a worthwhile investment which is gradually building towards the desired end goal. Going to wrap up now just by we're articulating what the next steps are likely to look like, therefore. So there are 4 steps that you need to think about. Firstly, defining your vision. So this means looking at where the marketplace is and where it's going to. And not everyone's going to have the same interpretation of what that is, but you need to have an approach which says, we think that these payment types are the ones to go for, we think these demographics of customers are the ones that we're interested in. You then need to work out within that how you want to win, because there are lots of ways of being successful. And do you want to be the company that's the cheapest and most efficient? Do you want to be the company that's at the cutting edge of all things payments? Do you want to be the company that understands your customer better than everyone else? I would recommend engaging with the market of suppliers early, because there is going to be a negotiation phase. Undoubtedly, lots of people will say, sure, we've got a product that's just right for you. They don't. You need to have that negotiation, and you need to learn from that as to what the market can do well, what it can't do well, and therefore what capabilities you will have to build in-house over time to get there. Oh, hang on, sorry, wrong one. Building a robust business case. So this is looking at both the benefits that can be accrued, and there are lots of them, and they're all small percentages of the transaction fees, so it's going to be a complicated model, but also looking at what the challenges are. What are those operational costs going to be? Where do you need to develop new capabilities? Where can you outsource those capabilities? What are those costs going to look like? And then finally, creating a rollout plan, as we mentioned, with incremental benefits, so that you don't alienate stakeholders as you go, and that everybody is brought in to the ongoing process. This has been a whistle-stop tour. I reiterate, there is a white paper which goes into a lot of these details in more depth, which we'll send out the link to.
That was great, Johnny. Thank you. It's very interesting. I'm kind of, here in the U.S., our entire society is addicted to credit, right? I mean, and a lot of the way credit cards are marketed and adopted has to do with all the benefits and the prestige of, you have a certain type of card and the points game and so forth. So when you look at other markets like China, and this was talked about earlier today, how much of that adoption is really driven by the fact that mobile is the way people are accessing the web, and it's a pure convenience thing versus notions about money and how you budget. Am I making sense? And I mean, I'm just kind of sitting here and wondering how long this whole world, when credit cards will no longer be dominant worldwide, and how much of that is just driven by mobile culture and what the marketing is going to look like. Because a lot of the way we carry, what cards we have in our pocket are driven by a lot more than just mobile payment convenience. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you're right, I don't think there is I've got to keep away from that to avoid feedback. I don't think there is a straightforward, the future is going to look like this. There will always be a role for lots of different types of payments, and there will always be different reasons for them. And as you say, the prestige and status of certain payment types, especially around credit cards, is always going to be there. If you look at things like Alipay, it almost isn't a payment type. Alipay is actually a social networking tool which allows you to talk to people, to go shopping, to look things up. Oh, and by the way, you can pay as well. So it's a very different cultural approach as to what you're doing when you're paying for something with Alipay. And this just is a glimpse of the complexity of what payments offers at the retail end, because it means so many different things to so many different people. So I don't think there's going to be a sudden crossover. You're absolutely right. In the West, credit cards are much more dominant than they are in other parts of the world. However, having said that, the decline in credit cards is faster in the United States than anywhere else in the world at the moment. So watch this space. I think it's changing. I think mobile phones are absolutely driving that, and it's largely about convenience.
And does your white paper talk about, because you spent a lot of time looking at this from the supplier and the kind of perspective, does your white paper talk about much from the consumer side and what's driving this, or is it more focused on the supplier side?
It's more focused on the supplier side, but absolutely it does refer to what some of the drivers are from a consumer's perspective.
Yeah.
And it's about convenience, it's about expectations, it's about a lack of understanding why a payment should take 3 days. If I want to send someone money, I expect them to get a beep on their phone shortly after I've pressed a button on my phone.
Right.
Credit cards don't enable that. And many other payment types don't enable that either. So it's that moving into a more digital world which requires certain payment types to
Great.
fund it.
We have a question from the audience.
Yeah, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you. You didn't touch much upon the notion of security. You talked about convenience. Are there trade-offs that are made? For example, many of us have been through card fraud situations, and the credit card company typically stands behind you as you, in Alipay, for example. Would they have the same kind of consumer protection from a security perspective of fraud? Is that as much of an issue or less of an issue? Could you spend a couple minutes talking about that?
Yeah, certainly. It's complicated, and it varies by payment type, and it varies by country because the regulators all have a different approach to that. But you're absolutely right. Part of the reason why credit cards are so expensive is because they offer that guarantee and that no quibble refund of money if there's any implication of fraud on your account. Other payment types don't offer that, and that's why they're cheaper. It's an ongoing debate, and different countries are adopting different approaches, but fundamentally, if you transfer money out of your bank account to someone else's bank account, you can probably say goodbye to that money. And if it turns out that you were duped and the person who persuaded you to send that money was in fact a fraudster, bad luck. You shouldn't have done it. The approach varies bank to bank and country to country, but you're right, there is a very real consumer risk aspect to that. On the other hand, there are much lower levels of fraud associated with payment types which require 2 factors of authentication at the point at which that payment is made. So there's a higher barrier for that fraud to be committed, and different types of fraud happen, and it's more about deception than it is about theft.
So Johnny, I got the signal from EyeforTravel that we need to take our last question, which is up on the screen, which is, what about cryptocurrencies and blockchain? Won't they make this whole thing obsolete?
No. Cryptocurrencies and blockchain still need to be processed by someone. They still need to be accepted by someone. You still need an acquirer. You still need to plug in to the blockchain somewhere. You could argue that cryptocurrencies are the future. Some people do argue that. Some people don't. Either way, you're going to have an acquiring relationship in order to process those. And so there are still going to be middlemen involved in any kind of cryptocurrency transaction, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Now, will you be around this evening and tomorrow, or just, okay, great.
Certainly am.
More chances to dialogue with you and find out about the white paper. Please join me in giving a big round of applause to Johnny Wyld.